Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're in our 7th and final session of our new program entitled Combating Bias in the Medical Legal Evaluation. And I have a fantastic conclusion to this entire program for you today. It's been my great honor and pleasure to research and bring this material to you. And if you've been with me along the course of this program, you are probably by now, like I am, a different person for having been exposed to this training on anti-bias training in the medical legal evaluation. You know, I have been changed forever professionally and personally as a result of this program. This program has brought new awareness to my consciousness about the prevalence and pernicious omnipresence, if you can believe that term, the pernicious omnipresence of bias, not only in society, but especially as relates to us as qualified medical evaluators in the medical legal evaluation. And the purpose of this program has been to increase your awareness of bias in general and also your own bias in an effort to help you become a better qualified medical evaluator such that you can render more accurate opinions and conclusions for all persons independent of the overlay or the impact of bias on your opinions and conclusions, so that once and for all, injured workers in the California workers' compensation system can be provided for benefits which are accurate in whichever direction those benefits may go, towards more benefits or towards more or less benefits. The conclusion will be for benefits that are more accurate once bias is eliminated from the system in general, and certainly and specifically from the opinions and conclusions of us as qualified medical evaluators. So I have a fascinating discussion for you today, and before we get into the topics of today's discussion, let's briefly review the purpose of this program so that we're all on the same page as we come sliding into home base with today's discussion. Remember that the purpose of this program is to explain to you how the Division of Workers' Compensation plans to combat bias in the medical legal evaluation, meaning at the face-to-face evaluation. They have a plan for that. And they have a plan to eliminate bias in the reporting of QMEs, to explain to you that plan. And then also to explain to you how that plan is expected to impact you as a qualified medical evaluator. If you can understand first the plan, and then number two, how the plan is expected to impact you, we can then quickly and accurately understand how we can arrive at opinions and conclusions and write our reports free from bias so that appropriate and accurate benefits can be provided for all purposes, for all persons. Now, it may seem a little bit difficult to reconcile the current trend toward anti-bias training with the Division of Workers' Compensation's larger and overall goal of improving the content and quality of QME reports. Well, this training, this direction, this anti-bias direction by the Division of Workers' Compensation is a small subpart of the division's larger plan to help improve the content and quality of QME reports. And this plan, the anti-bias direction, the anti-bias movement, will help qualified medical evaluators write better reports that are more accurate reports, that are free from the impact of bias on the opinions and conclusions of the qualified medical evaluator. So the whole purpose of this anti-bias thrust, so to say, is to improve the accuracy of qualified medical evaluators' reports. The whole system is striving toward greater accuracy, and no party has any problem with opinions and conclusions from us as qualified medical evaluators that are accurate. Okay? So with accuracy as our objective and as our target, let's review what we've covered in sessions 1 through 6 of this program. In session number 1 of this program, we talked about the origin of the concern for bias in the medical legal evaluation. And this traces back to the 2016 Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit, which was a lawsuit filed by a group of women in California who alleged that the California workers' compensation system was discriminatory against women, that there was gender-based discrimination in the system as a whole. And this lawsuit brought attention to the concept of bias in the medical legal evaluation and started the ball rolling to bring us to the point where we are today in 2021, where laws are being rewritten and regulations are being adopted with the express purpose of attacking evidences of bias and how those biases contribute to inaccuracy in workers' compensation benefits. So the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit was a landmark case. It was a precedent-setting case that has created ripple effects all the way up into today. And many of the new laws that are being passed, the new regulations that are being considered by the Division of Workers' Compensation are being expressly written to address issues raised in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit. So if you're purchasing this course for continuing education credits, I've included the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit as part of your handout materials. I suggest that you read that lawsuit three times, because each time you read it, you'll read it with new, more mature eyes, and you'll get more out of it, and you'll gain more understanding as to the great suppression that women suffered at the hands of largely male evaluators and male authors of the AMA guides. And the Page versus Perry Soto group of women were very courageous in stepping forward, and they are responsible for bringing us to the point in time where we are today, on the cusp of introducing anti-bias training for all qualified medical evaluators throughout the state. In session number 2, we talked about how the Division of Workers' Compensation plans to eliminate bias from, number 1, the face-to-face evaluation, and in the opinions and conclusions of the qualified medical evaluator. And we saw that this plan encompasses the entire career of the qualified medical evaluator, beginning from before the doctor even sits for the QME competency exam, all the way through the QME's career, all the way till the point in time when the QME declares himself to be unavailable, and all throughout the lifespan or life cycle of the qualified medical evaluator, the division is going to be requiring that qualified medical evaluators complete and document successful completion of anti-bias training every 2 years. So the Division of Workers' Compensation has a very comprehensive plan. In session number 3 of this program, we defined bias by taking a look at the concepts of social in-groups and social out-groups. And here, this is the crux of the whole matter. It's those persons who you identify to be in your social out-group, those persons who have characteristics different from those of your own, different characteristics such as different race, different gender, different sexual orientation, different religious affiliation. Persons who are different from us, we tend to place in this filing cabinet in our mind that considers them to be different from us. These are called out-group characteristics. So we place people in social in-groups and social out-groups. Well, unfortunately and reflexively as a species, we tend to provide favor to persons who are placed in our social in-groups, and we tend to punish or burden or opine against in the medical legal evaluation against persons in our social out-groups. So it's very important that you become aware of this tendency to out-group persons who are different from you, and to be able to handle and manage this tendency so that the opinions and conclusions that you offer as a qualified medical evaluator do not unnecessarily and unfairly and soon to be unlawfully punish or burden those persons simply because they are different from you, or different from us, or different from me. So we define this concept of social in-groups and out-groups, and then in session number 4, we talked about the types of bias, such as unconscious or implicit bias or stereotyping, and the opposite of that, which is conscious or explicit or conscious stereotyping. And then we talked about the targets of bias, a fascinating discussion. There's 2 basic targets of bias in the medical legal evaluation. There are person targets such as the claims administrator, applicant attorney, defense attorney, injured worker, qualified medical evaluator. These are person targets of bias, and each of those persons have implicit biases toward each of the other persons involved in the medical legal evaluation. This is sad, but it's very, very true. And I've experienced this many, many times, including very recently when I experienced an unfortunate incident where I myself was a target of person bias in the medical legal evaluation. So there are person targets of bias, and then there are characteristics targets of bias. And characteristics could be some things, for example, as physical condition. When your examinee is in a different physical condition than you are, you tend to burden and punish that person for having a different physical condition. Race is a target of bias. Gender is a target of bias. Nation of origin is a target of bias. Religious affiliation is a target of bias. Marital status, and all these characteristics are targets of bias, which the Division of Workers' Compensation is insisting now that we become impervious to, that these targets do not in any way contribute to the construction of accurate opinions and conclusions in our final product QME report. And then in session 5 and 6, we got real and we got down into some actual cases. And I shared with you 4 examples, 4 actual cases that demonstrate overt bias in the medical legal evaluation. And we had cases that involved gender bias, cases that involved racial bias, and cases that involved claims bias, wherein largely the persons, claims administrators across the industry are largely white and female, who are administering claims for a different population, mostly male, and in many cases, for a large percentage of injured worker cases, a preponderance of injured worker cases involve minority races, such as black males and such as Hispanic males. So we see examples across the industry where black males and Hispanic males claims are being administered by white females, many of whom speak even a different language than the injured worker. So I shared with you some real-life examples of overt bias in the medical legal evaluation. And the purpose of all these sessions was to address several questions that have been posed by outside parties looking in on the workers' compensation system from the outside in. Number 1, does bias exist in the medical legal evaluation? And the answer to that was a definitive yes. Number 2, can a biased species, such as us as qualified medical evaluators, can we reasonably be expected to be, in part anyway, rehabilitated to the point where we can once and for all actually render opinions and conclusions not shaped, formed, formulated through the colored lenses of implicit bias and implicit stereotypes? And that is the Division of Workers' Compensation's plan, is to rehabilitate us as a species. Third, we took a look at the question, are your opinions, meaning you, doctor, and meaning me as a qualified medical evaluator, are your opinions and conclusions influenced and impacted by your conscious or unconscious biases? And the answer to that is equivocally a yes. In fact, there is absolutely no way that your opinions and conclusions could not be colored by your unconscious biases, because these are beliefs, feelings, insights, intuitions, preconceptions, pre-reflective attributions that we've all held since way back in time, way back to our childhood, that relate to our upbringing, that relate to all of our exposures through our contacts with people, through our exposure to the media, etc. All of these experiences have resulted in the deep ingraining of unconscious stereotypes and implicit biases that shape all of our behaviors, they shape all of our thoughts, they shape all of our opinions, they shape all of our attitudes, and certainly in the medical legal evaluation, they shape our opinions and conclusions. Well, if that's true, what could possibly be the very next question that a program on combating bias in the medical legal evaluation should address? The next question that a program should address, and brings us to the topic of today's discussion, our final session in this series, is if indeed bias exists in the medical legal evaluation, and if indeed my opinions and conclusions are shaped and formed by my lifetime of unconscious stereotyping of persons who sit across from me in the face-to-face evaluation, how can I? Is it even possible? How can I eliminate biases from my opinions and conclusions? And I want to share with you in our final session of today's discussion a formula that has been adopted out in the general society by various educational institutions wherein bias is a problem. So, for example, in government, for example, in major businesses that employ thousands of people, these are groups and sectors that have taken a look at bias in the workplace, bias in society, bias in government, and have initiated action plans to quell, to calm, and to possibly even eliminate bias in these particular sectors. And there's every reason to believe that this formula, this procedure, is something that can work for us as qualified medical evaluators as well, because the whole solution to eliminating bias, at least in the medical legal evaluation, has to do with increasing our own awareness of the existence of bias and our own awareness as to how bias impacts our opinions and conclusions. And just simply, if we can increase the awareness of these things, we can better handle our own biases when they rise up and threaten to thwart our opinions and conclusions. So that's the topic of today's discussion, and let's begin into a three-step formula for eliminating bias in the face-to-face evaluation. Okay, and that three-step procedure to eliminate bias in the medical legal evaluation is as follows. Step number one is to create awareness or increase your awareness if you already have some awareness. Increase your awareness of bias through what are referred to as implicit association tests, IAT. And there are many, many different types of implicit association tests, and I'll share with you a website that has many, many of these tests that you can take for free that will help you increase your own awareness of bias towards several different target groups who are many times throughout society impacted by the negative effects of bias. Now, once your awareness is increased, or you've created some awareness about bias, then there's a series of anti-bias training tasks that have been shown to be useful to at least reducing bias associated with those target groups. So you might find that you have a tendency to have a component of racial bias, the anti-bias training tasks would help to reduce your tendency to have racial bias, to have opinions and conclusions and preconceived notions about persons of a different race than you are. Well, after completing a series of anti-bias training tasks, then there are post-tests available. Post-tests, so we have pre-tests here. These are pre-test tasks, and then post-tests, and hopefully the post-tests would show some diminution in bias, at least against the particular target group that you have been demonstrated to have some bias towards. Okay? And I've put for you here a website. This is from Harvard University, where you can access several different implicit association tests to test your own bias against various target groups. And I'll show you some of these tests right here. So here are several implicit association tests. These are found on the harvard.edu website that I shared with you on the previous slide. And it shows several different types of tests, such as an age implicit association test, a transgender test, a president's test, a gender career test, a sexuality test, a race test, a native test, skin tone, disability. I myself yesterday took the disability implicit association test, and this test, according to the description, requires the ability to recognize symbols representing abled and disabled individuals. And I found through my scoring on this test that I have a tendency, a bias towards favoring able-bodied persons compared to disabled persons, and that my bias is towards to tend to disfavor persons of handicap or of various disabilities. So with this known, I could then go through a series of anti-bias training tasks to learn more and understand more about persons of disability, come back and take a post-test and hopefully score lower on the disability post-test. And these are all different types of targets of bias, such as religion, such as being from an Asian country of origin, such as being of thin body type or of heavy body type. So all of these implicit association tests are available, and at least as regards us as qualified medical evaluators, you can see that some of these tests would be directly applicable to the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators. Okay, so that's step one, is to take one or more of the implicit association tests, and then once your score is understood on those tests, you can undergo several different implicit training tasks, the purpose of which is to reduce your score on those implicit association tests. So let's talk now about some of those implicit training tasks. Okay, so let's talk about several implicit training tasks, and I have 4 to share with you today that are relevant to the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators, and that can be adapted to our face-to-face evaluation and also to our medical legal reporting. Okay, so the first of which is referred to in the literature as stereotype replacement. And this is a training task that has been shown to successfully reduce pre- and post implicit association test scores. So with stereotype replacements, what you do with this training task is you try to recognize your stereotypes toward people who are different from you. And I'll share some examples with you here in just a minute. So by first trying to recognize your stereotypes, this is the first step toward increasing your own awareness of the existence of these stereotypes in you. So once you do that, then you take a moment to reflect on why you have these stereotypes and perhaps where these stereotypes may have originated in you at some or various points throughout your lifetime. Then you consider how to avoid these stereotypes in the future and come up with unbiased responses to replace the existing stereotype. And this is something that you can do at your very next face-to-face evaluation when you sit across the table or you sit across the desk from an examinee who's different from you, who's a different gender than you, who has a different race than you, who was born in a different country from you, who may speak a different language from you, who may look different from you, who may look different from you. These people all will look different from you. And you have stereotypes, multiple layers of stereotypes about each of these persons who are different from you. And the exercise is to come up with new responses, unstereotyped, neutral, objective responses to replace the stereotype to more accurately continue and commence and proceed with the face-to-face evaluation. So that's called stereotype replacement. And the next is very similar. It's called counter-stereotype training. With counter-stereotype training, once you have your stereotype established, you try to picture examples of the opposite stereotype being applied to your particular examinee. So if you have a stereotype about persons from a different country than you, whatever that stereotype would be, if you consider those people to be poor, if you consider those people to be lazy, if you consider those people to be uneducated, if you consider those people to be deviant, whatever the stereotype is, you picture examples of the opposite of that stereotype. You apply a counter stereotype to that person, and you can see this example being demonstrated in the media these days. If you watch 30 minutes of commercials, or if you watch a 30-minute program and sit through 6 minutes of commercials, you'll see almost every commercial nowadays is exercising counter stereotyping in the characters displayed in the commercial. All of the characters being displayed in modern commercials show mixed and diverse groups, all counter stereotyped to what the conventional stereotype that we may have regarding each of those individuals being portrayed in the commercial. So you picture your examinee as having the opposite characteristics of those that you would typically associate with them in stereotypic fashion. Okay, so the first two implicit bias training tasks involve stereotype replacement and counter stereotyping. The third type of implicit bias training task involves what's referred to as negation. And this is just an exercise wherein you imagine a stereotype. You imagine a target of stereotype, perhaps a person of a different race, and you associate that race with your stereotype. For example, if you consider persons from a different country to be lazy, or you consider them to be poor, or you consider them to be uneducated, when you think of that thought, or when you see a picture, or when you sit across from a person at the face-to-face evaluation, you would repeat to yourself as an exercise, no, or that's wrong, that's wrong. And these statements, no and that's wrong, negate negate the stereotype. Many times, the stereotype is not true. And in fact, not every person from a different foreign country from you, where you're from, is lazy, is poor, is uneducated. It's simply a stereotype that's probably in large part wrong. And negation training helps to illuminate or elucidate the incorrectness of the stereotype. And then similarly, when you think of a person from a different country, and whereas before your stereotype would be that that particular person was lazy, and you're presented with information, perhaps in the history, perhaps in the medical records that you received, that's inconsistent with that stereotype. In other words, you learn that this person is a hardworking, is a diligent person, is a motivated person, is a successful person. The image or the information that you receive is inconsistent with the stereotype. As an exercise, you would repeat to yourself, yes, yes, to confirm the inconsistency of the stereotype. This is referred to as negation bias training task. And negation has been proven to be effective in reducing pre- and post-test scores on implicit association tests. And then finally, another effective technique that we can employ as qualified medical evaluators, especially during the face-to-face evaluation as we interview and interact with our examinee, is referred to as perspective taking. And with perspective taking, you reflect on a person's life. You reflect on the story that they share with you. And you imagine yourself as going through the same scenario and wondering to yourself, how would you experience that scenario? How would you respond to that scenario? How would you react to that scenario? How would you sense that scenario? And you try and imagine yourself in the shoes. It gives you a chance to walk in the shoes of another person. Walk 1,000 miles in another person's shoes. And perspective taking allows you to do that, thereby enhancing your empathy and your understanding of what it is that this person is going through. And it helps to eliminate your stereotypes and your biases related to this particular person who may be different from you, because you can easily step within their shoes and experience all of the same emotions, all of the same feelings, all of the same fears, all of the same anxieties that they would feel going through the same situation. And so this is referred to as perspective taking, and this is something that we can use in the face-to-face evaluation. So let me give you some examples as to how we could employ these in our very next face-to-face evaluation with our very next examinee. Okay, so here we have a table with various injured workers. Over here in the left-hand column, we have injured workers of a different race than us, injured workers of a different nation of origin than us, injured workers with a different physical condition than us, injured workers with a different gender than us, etc. These are different characteristic targets of bias here that define these people as different from us and therefore in our social outgroup. Well, with the stereotype replacement bias training task, you would go through the same three-step procedure with each particular characteristic. Number one, you would recognize what type of bias you have regarding persons of this particular race. Number two, you would reflect on that and try to understand what was the source of that bias, where has that bias been reinforced throughout your entire life, and what is the basis, what is behind, what is the substance behind that bias. And then once you understand that, you can attempt to replace your stereotyped response toward persons of that race with more functional, unbiased responses that are more accurate to persons who are of a different race than you. And the same three-step procedure would apply to persons of a different nation of origin here, persons of a different physical condition, persons of a different physical gender, It's recognize your stereotypes, reflect on those stereotypes, and then replace those stereotypes with unbiased responses towards people who are different from you. With the counter-stereotyping method, you would create a mental image picture of the counter-stereotype of persons of different races than you. So if you have this stereotype in your mind, for example, and I'm just making this up, that persons, I'm a white author, speaker of this program, so someone different from me would be perhaps a Hispanic injured worker, or a black injured worker, or an Asian injured worker, and you would create a mental image picture of the counter-stereotype that you have of persons of that race. So for example, if you had a stereotype that persons of a different race than you are lazy and uneducated, you might picture those persons being very, very hardworking and very highly educated. And there are persons of different races than you and than I that are hardworking and are very highly educated. So this is counter-stereotyping, and you could apply that same procedure to persons of a different nation of origin, persons of a different physical condition than you, different persons of a different gender than you. You create a mental image picture of the counter-stereotype of that particular characteristic. And I challenge you to watch 30 minutes of television tonight and respond to me that counter-stereotyping is not what's operative in each and every commercial that you see nowadays. Okay, so that's counter-stereotyping. With negation, you simply repeat to yourself, no, or that's wrong, when you encounter information that's consistent with your stereotype regarding race, regarding nation of origin, regarding gender. So for example, if you believe that persons from, let's say India, the nation of origin is India, you believe that persons from Indian descent are extremely cunning, are extremely deviant, are extremely suspicious. I'm just making these up. I'm not insinuating that I believe these things. I'm just making these up. You would repeat to yourself, that's wrong. That's wrong, over and over, to negate that particular stereotype. You would repeat no, or you would repeat that's wrong, to negate the particular stereotype. Conversely, when you encounter information that's inconsistent with your stereotype, you could create an affirmatory response by saying yes, or that's correct, that would confirm the inconsistency of that particular stereotype. That's called negation training task. Then finally, with the perspective taking training task, you simply imagine a day in the life, or you put yourself in the shoes of the injured worker as the injured worker relays to you the mechanism of injury, as the injured worker relays to you how they reported this incident to their supervisor, as they relay to you how they're continuing to experience symptoms and ongoing limitations with activities of daily living. You put yourself in the shoes of your injured worker to develop empathy and to create a better understanding as to what this particular person is going through, in actuality uncolored by your particular stereotypes. So all of these techniques can be applied to the face-to-face evaluation that we as qualified medical evaluators engage in with our injured workers. And let me give you just one more example to help make this even more real for you. Okay, so let's do this as an exercise. Imagine that you have this as your very next injured worker. This is the person that presents to you. And you recognize this person, if you're a male evaluator, as being of a different gender than you. And based on the attire, you recognize this as a person being from a different nation of origin as you. How could you use stereotype replacement to more accurately report on this character of an injured worker? Well, again, you would go through the three-step process of recognizing any stereotypes that you might have regarding persons of this country. If you believe that women from this particular country have arranged marriages and live a suppressed lifestyle, always deferring to the male figure, you might take some time to recognize what are your stereotypes. And then you would reflect on that stereotype to determine what is the origin of that. Where did you learn that? And what is it that gives that stereotype legs? And then you would create efforts, you would put forth efforts to replace that particular stereotype with information that is more accurate regarding this particular person sitting in front of you, because it's not a stereotype that sits in front of you, it's an actual person who may not resemble in any way the stereotype that you have had regarding this particular person. Well, what about this examinee? Imagine that this examinee comes to you for your next face-to-face evaluation. What type of stereotype would you have about this particular person? Now, this person may be from a different country of origin as you, may speak a different language as you, may have a different somatotype, a different physical body condition than you, and you may associate this type of person with particular characteristics as perhaps being lazy, as perhaps being sneaky, as perhaps being devious. I'm not sure. I'm making these up. I don't know what your stereotype would be. I'm just using these as examples. And you would create the mental image picture of the opposite. You would create a mental image video in your mind of this person being an extremely hard worker, of being extremely successful, of being extremely well spoken, of being extremely educated, of being extremely detail-oriented, extremely meticulous, or whatever characteristics are counter to your existing stereotype. When you see an injured worker that looks like this, that looks different from you. With negation training, imagine that you're doing an examination on this injured worker, and this injured worker who's female, who appears to be probably about 40 years of age and who has this large tattoo on her back. You may have some stereotypes about this particular examinee, and you would counter those stereotypes by using negation as your method to eliminate that particular stereotype. And when that stereotype comes to your mind, you would simply repeat to yourself, that's wrong, that's no, or no, that's wrong, that's not accurate, and you could negate that particular stereotype. Finally, imagine that you have this injured worker comes to you for your face-to-face evaluation, and if this picture is not very clear, this is a transgender female in this image. This is a formerly male, now female transgender person. What stereotypes could you imagine that you could have when encountering a person with a different sexual orientation than you, a different gender than you? Well, you can counter those stereotypes by using the method of perspective taking, by imagining a day in the life of a transgender person. You can imagine that a transgender person may have some days in their life that involve some difficulties. And if you imagine a day in the life and you go through those difficulties yourself, even if only mentally, it can help you develop more empathy and understanding of this person who's different from you, so that you can better arrive at opinions and conclusions that are accurate. So all of these methods, these implicit bias training methods, are applicable to the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators, and we can use one or more or even all of these methods with our very next examinee to help us to arrive at a more accurate conclusion in the written portion of our reports. Then finally, once you've gone through all of those exercises in the face-to-face evaluation, it comes time to write your final opinions and conclusions in your QME report. And it's important that your opinions and conclusions are accurate. So accuracy of your opinions and conclusions directly relates to the benefits received by injured workers. And so in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit, those women alleged that discrimination and bias in the workers' compensation system adversely impacted their permanent impairment ratings, that their permanent impairment rating was lowered based on gender discrimination, and then also the apportionment approximate percentages were not accurate because qualified medical evaluators were providing for apportionment to other factors based on various bias targets. So as you write your qualified medical evaluation report, you need to make sure that your impairment ratings are not unfairly and unlawfully lowered on the basis of some bias that you may have regarding race, regarding gender, regarding national origin, regarding religious orientation, regarding sexual preference, or regarding any of the other targets of bias. Now, these are some of the targets that are described in the QME regulations, such as the disclosure requirements under CCR 40 and under the new QME regulations involved with anti-bias training. These are some of the targets that are described, but these aren't the only targets that are subjects of bias in the work that we do, and we need to make sure that our permanent impairment ratings are uncolored, are unimpacted by our biases based on at least these and other targets of bias. We need to consider all impairments, both the primary impairments and any secondary impairments that our injured worker may have suffered as a result of the primary impairment. And this is the direct result of the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit, wherein women who suffered industrial breast cancer and underwent treatment involving either single or double mastectomy received a 0% permanent impairment rating for the loss of one or two breasts because the AMA guides provide for a 0% whole person impairment rating for single or double mastectomy in a non-nursing female. Okay? Well, the mastectomy procedure involves the primary impairment. The women in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit alleged that none of their secondary impairments, none of the harms that were unique to them as women, were considered by the qualified medical evaluator. Secondary impairments such as skin scarring, such as loss of muscle strength of the pectoralis major, such as swelling in the arm due to disruption of axillary lymph nodes, such as numbness in the upper extremity as a result of surgical intervention and penetrating the skin. In other words, none of the secondary impairments were being considered, and therefore their permanent impairment ratings were unfairly and inaccurately lowered as a result of gender bias at the hands of mostly male evaluators. So our permanent impairment determinations need to be accurate and need to be uninfluenced by the various targets of bias. Now, finally, once we've had our impairment percentages accurately stated and accurately described, we need to make sure that our apportionment considerations are also accurate. And this again traces back to the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit, wherein the women alleged that their permanent impairment ratings were unlawfully apportioned to the risk factor of being female. And this had to do mostly with cases involving carpal tunnel syndrome, where the qualified medical evaluator provided for an impairment rating for carpal tunnel syndrome, but then apportioned some of that impairment out due to being female, because it's known in the literature that many females, especially postmenopausal females, for whatever reason, develop carpal tunnel syndrome. Well, these women couldn't help or couldn't influence in any way the fact that they were female, and they felt that it was unfair to apportion any of the permanent impairment to the fact that they were female, and that represented inaccurate and unlawful apportionment, because there are many, many postmenopausal female women who do not have carpal tunnel syndrome. So they were being discriminated against simply on the basis that they were women. Well, it's a great day for the plaintiffs in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit, because now in 2021, in June, let's just say 6 of 2021, June of 2021, the plaintiffs in the Page versus Perry Soto lawsuit had their dreams realized with the passage of Senate Bill 788. Now pay very close attention. Senate Bill 788 rewrites Labor Code 4663, which is our apportionment law, correct? 4663 and 4664. So this bill rewrites 4663, and this bill now prohibits the consideration of all of these targets of bias, of race, of religious creed, of color, of national origin, gender, marital status, sex, sexual identity, or sexual orientation in the development of an apportionment declaration, the purpose of which is for us to provide apportionment approximate percentages that are accurate and that are not based on stereotypes regarding any of these particular targets of bias. So in this way, the whole movement toward eliminating bias in the medical legal evaluation, which is supported by all parties, by the way, supported by all parties and all players in the system, and is now supported by the legislature with the passage of this bill. This is now law, which rewrites Labor Code 4663, which is law. This is supported by all parties because all parties are supremely concerned with accuracy in the opinions and conclusions of qualified medical evaluators, and this new accuracy that's free from bias will help contribute to the larger, bigger picture of improving the content quality and usability and accuracy and substantiability of qualified medical evaluators' reports, such that those reports can once and for all be accurate, can be substantial, and can be used to resolve the disputed issues in the case. What a concept. So doctors, I want to thank you for sticking with me to the very end of this program. If you're hearing me speak to you now, you're at the end of session 7 of a 7-part series, which is brand new, unseen anywhere else in the industry. This is a brand new concept. You're receiving 7 hours of training on anti-bias and combating bias in the medical legal evaluation. This places you at the very top of the profession, at the very front tip of the spear as to where the profession is going in the very near future and also long into the future, as anti-bias training becomes a part of all of our ongoing education as qualified medical evaluators. Now, let me share with you that eliminating bias in the medical legal evaluation begins with you. All of what we've been discussing in this program has to do with eliminating bias in the medical legal evaluation. And I've received many, many comments from doctors who've heard my words, who have come back and shared with me that bias in the medical legal evaluation is not the only source of bias in workers' compensation. There is many other forms and persons engaged in bias in addition to qualified medical evaluators, and that is true. I acknowledge that there is claims administrator bias. I acknowledge that there is judge bias. I acknowledge that there is applicant attorney bias and defense attorney bias. And bias exists in the workers' compensation. But combating and eliminating bias, at least in the medical legal evaluation, begins with us as qualified medical evaluators. This is our responsibility. This is our realm. This is the realm under which we have control. And it's my belief and opinion that we're now in the new anti-bias era. And we now have every right to stand up and stand up against stereotypes that have been existing throughout the years, decades, and even generations, not only in the medical legal evaluation, but in society and in life all around us. And if you've ever been the target of unfair, uncaring, and unkind bias, you know how terrible it is and how terrible it feels and what it does to you inside. And it's a terrible thing. And so combating bias and eliminating bias begins with us. And perhaps by tackling some of our long-held stereotypes within each of us, perhaps we can, in small measure, make the system and make the world a little bit better. And after all, those should be our objectives. Number one, to improve the workers' compensation system within which we participate so importantly, and then also improving our own world and improving our relationships with people with whom we come into contact with, in the hopes that by changing inside each of us, our world around us that we experience will also change for the better as well. So these changes begin with each of us, and I'm encouraging you to take this training seriously and take it to heart with your very next face-to-face evaluation, and really give your injured worker a fair look, an objective look, and neutral look, uncolored and unaffected and unimpacted by your lifetime, through no fault of your own, your lifetime of unconscious and implicit stereotypes and biases. And in this small way, you and I and all of us can contribute to ongoing improvement in the work that we do and in the California workers' compensation system. So doctors, I want to thank you for your commitment to excellence. I want to thank you for embracing the spirit of this program as it's intended. And I want to thank you for the important work that you do. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I look forward to being with you on future sessions. And for now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.